Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement team in the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at CPL, welcome. Before we begin, we ask you please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the CPL staff who worked to make this event possible. Books are available for purchase in the lobby, and the authors will sign books at the conclusion of the program. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. So if you have a friend who missed it, let them know. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience, and we ask you to please line up at the microphone, which I'll put right here, so that everyone can hear you, and also our virtual viewers can hear you as well. And virtual viewers, if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Alec Nevala-Lee to discuss his new book, Collisions, a physicist's journey from Hiroshima to the death of the dinosaurs. Alec is the author of Inventor of the Future, The Visionary Life of Buckminster Fuller, which was selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and one of Esquire's 50 best biographies of all time, as well as the Hugo Award finalist Astounding, John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction. His new book, Collisions, is the first biography of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis W. Alvarez. We are thrilled to have Alec here tonight with Melissa Harris. Melissa is CEO and founder of marketing firm M. Harris & Company, an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and author of the book Everybody Needs an Editor. Alongside Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Mary Schmeek, Melissa founded the media company Mary and Melissa Productions and produced a 7-part podcast series called Division Street Revisited, which you can listen to on all major podcast platforms, and CPL was very proud to partner with them on it. Please join me in welcoming Alec and Melissa to the CPL stage.
Hey, Jennifer, because we have folks online, I need to use this microphone. Is that correct? Okay, wonderful. Alec, do you want to give a quick test of that?
Does it sound okay?
Yes, I think we're great. So I took notes all the way through this book. My questions are in the book. And let me just be clear. I think the biggest OMG in the whole book is the last, basically, chapter of his professional life. This is the dude who figured out that asteroids killed the dinosaurs, right?
Yeah. No, there's a story I like to tell, actually, that involves my nephew, who is 5. And he's, like a lot of kids, including me, he's going through a dinosaur phase right now.
So is my son. He's 6.
Right. So he's got dinosaur stuff everywhere. And I actually asked him, do you know what happened to the dinosaurs? Why aren't there dinosaurs now? And he said, asteroid. So a 5-year-old kid, right, is familiar with what Alvarez did, which to me is stunning. I mean, there are very few scientists where you can say that's true.
It's amazing. And what also was amazing is how they figured this out. So the first part that's fascinating is that it's because of his son, whom he kind of seemed to maybe not pay attention to as much as he wasn't exactly maybe a doting father. But later in life, his son came to him with a rock. And his son, Walt, is a geologist. Can you tell me about this rock?
Yeah, no, I love this because it's a father-son story, which I find really interesting. And, it is like a remarkable closing chapter in a life that was already incredibly eventful. All right, so just for context.
He'd already won a Nobel.
When this happens, yeah. So Alvarez was already a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, the period that we're going to talk about here occurred when he was already in his late 60s. So he had won...
Old.
He had won all these awards. He had, had several careers.
Which we'll get to in a minute.
Had done more than almost anyone, scientist had, during, that generation. All right. So this is the point. Like, this is a out of left field, incredibly surprising thing that happened to him that ended up being his most important achievement. All right. And it's because of Walt. So I've gotten to know Walter Alvarez, his son, fairly well. I actually had lunch with them on Thursday, him and his family. And, so Walter is in his 80s now. And during this period, he was in his mid-30s. And so he was a geologist. Okay, and the key thing to bear in mind here is that Alvarez, the father, Luis Alvarez, was a physicist who did not think that geology was an interesting science,
Yes.
right? He thought it was observational. He didn't have a lot of interest in like purely observational sciences, and he was like really confused as to why his son would have chosen such an uninteresting field. All right, and just a little side note is that it was actually because of Walt's mother, Geraldine, who actually got him interested in geology. He gave him his first rock hammer and encouraged him to go into the Berkeley Hills and look for fossils. So, if it weren't for Geraldine, none of this would have happened.
There we go.
So what happens is that Walter is looking into what are called magnetic reversals. So the Earth, has a north and a south pole, magnetic poles, and for reasons that are, I think, still controversial, that pole has reversed polarity at various points, in the past. All right. So what used to be the North Pole, was then the South Pole, and vice versa. So Walter wants to figure out the timeline, like when did these things happen? And you can look at these special minerals, like in rock layers, to figure out, which way was the pole oriented during, a certain time period. But to do that, you have to be able to like date these layers and figure out how long they took to form. And so,
a special place in Italy.
yes,
where
this
they
is
find
really
this
cool.
rock.
Yeah, there's like one gorge in Italy that has a beautiful exposed sequence of layers, and that's where Walter was focusing his work. So he wants to know how long it takes, for a layer to form, because you see like a thin layer, and you think, okay, well that didn't take very long to form, but maybe the rate was different back then. We just don't know. So we need like a way to figure out how long these layers took to form. And Alvarez, kind of sees it as a chance to collaborate with his son. They were not close, as we noted. And I think, at that point, Alvarez, he's getting older. He realizes that, this is his one chance to connect with Walter. And so I think he is motivated by the idea that let's find a project together. Let's find something that we can work on while we still have time, where we can be a team. And so what happens is that there's one particular layer that is very unusual, all right? And this is a layer of reddish clay that coincides with the point, at that time it was thought to be about 65 million years ago. Now it's believed to be more like 66 million years ago. That marks a huge mass extinction that wiped out, many species, including the dinosaurs. And what happens is that Walter takes a little piece of rock, which I actually saw. I got to hold this piece of rock on Thursday.
He has a picture of him.
It was really cool. I
figured out how the dinosaurs died. It's amazing.
I went to Walter's house, and the first thing I asked was, "Do you have that rock?" Because I really wanted to see it. And so he actually made it into like a little paperweight for his dad, and he gave it to his dad. And you can see this clay layer, and below it, you see all these microorganisms called forams, which are really abundant, in the limestone from the earlier period. And then above the clay layer, the larger ones are gone. They're gone. And so something happened, right? Something happened in this one clay layer to wipe out not just these, organisms, but also the dinosaurs. And Alvarez is like really fascinated. He says like, this is like one of the most interesting things I've ever seen. And famously he says to Walter, well, maybe geology is interesting after all, after years of being skeptical of like his son's choice of field. So I don't know how technical you want me to get.
Well, this is what I'll say. I'll summarize it, and I think the level is that basically Lewis takes this rock to his lab and fires stuff at it, right? In a some sort of chamber or cyclotron.
Yeah. So the really short version is that how do you figure out how long this layer of clay took to form, right? How long did it take to deposit this layer of clay? And what Alvarez eventually figures out is that meteorites enter the Earth's atmosphere every year, and they become dust. And all this dust settles down, onto the Earth's surface. And the more dust there is in the clay layer, the longer it took to form. Right, which kind of makes intuitive sense. Right. But it's like, how do you measure how much meteoritic dust there is in a clay layer? And Alvarez figures out, well, meteorites, for various reasons, have more of certain kinds of elements in them than you normally find in the Earth's crust. And one of them is iridium. All right. So he says, if you find like, how much iridium is in this, layer, you can kind of estimate how long it took to form.
Yes.
Right. So what happened is he figures out a way to look for iridium, and he's expecting to find like a bump, kind of in, either direction based on, what he's expecting to see. But it's actually huge.
It's a huge bump.
It's like 30 times more iridium than he expected to see. Right. And there's no way it could have been caused by like kind of the routine deposition of meteoritic dust.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says, well, this is like a totally surprising thing, right? He did not expect this. But he's a pro. And he knows that when you see a really unusual, unexpected thing, you have to pause. You have to say, what could this reflect? What could this be? And he realizes, well, something happened that involves space.
Yeah, this is how he wrote it down. He found a massive amount of iridium in the Earth layer. Iridium, we know, comes from space. Therefore, something had to bring it from space to the Earth.
Right. And the funny thing is that the idea that it was an asteroid was not obvious. Okay, I think for us now, you're like, oh, obviously there was like a big, like an asteroid strike and it caused this disaster. But, at first Alvarez thought maybe it's a supernova.
Right.
Or maybe it's a big cloud of hydrogen, that suffocates things.
A solar flare.
Yeah. So he like thinks of everything that he can possibly imagine that might come from space that could kill,
Right.
like cause like a global extinction event. The issue is that if you imagine like an asteroid hitting the Earth, it's kind of unclear why that would cause a global event. Right, because obviously it's fatal to anything that's underneath it.
Right.
But why would dinosaurs on the other side of the world be affected?
The dust covers the sun.
Which we know now, right? It's like now it seems kind of obvious, but it took a long time to say the dust cloud.
Right.
The dust cloud that it created would block out the sun for weeks, kill off the plants, kill off the herbivores, kill off the carnivores, know. But, Alvarez had to like really think about this. It took a long time for him to, arrive at what he calls the killing mechanism.
Yep. And then what I'll just say to conclude this is that although Luis Alvarez was gone by this time, Walt Alvarez was around long enough for them to find the actual site that the asteroid hit, which is off the Yucatan Peninsula in the ocean, right?
Yeah. So the one thing I want to like underline here is that this was really controversial. Okay. Yes. Right now, it is kind of like conventional wisdom. We all know that an asteroid strike killed the dinosaurs, but a lot of paleontologists really, really did not like this idea. Okay.
And Lewis was a jerk.
Yes, Lewis did not help matters. All right, he was a difficult guy who loved to fight. Right, and so this was this like controversy that played out in the papers. It played out, in like conferences in this like very public way. That sometimes it got very personal. Because geologists, they don't like sudden change. Right. They don't. They like to think of things happening gradually. And so the idea that this guy who's not even a geologist or a paleontologist just kind of comes out of nowhere and like says, oh well, I have the answer that has eluded you for all these years. It's really off-putting. Right.
Yes.
And he was arrogant. He did not frame things in a diplomatic way. And so there was a lot of pushback. And, they did not find like the crater, the smoking gun, until after he was dead.
Right.
Yeah. So eventually I would say he was vindicated. We know for, I would say, a fact now that it was an asteroid strike that killed the dinosaurs. But, it took a long time. It took years for this to become the consensus. Yes. And, I encourage you to read the book just to sort of see like how ad hominem and personal these things can become. Yeah. In a way that we don't tend to think about when it comes to science.
So there are some, I loved that in his early career when he was working in the special division during World War II, they called his divisions Louis Gadgets. They called it was like a division of Louis Gadgets. And I just want to mention some of the gadgets that he played a role in inventing. And I'm curious if you have a favorite and want to tell a story about one. Okay, so we have advanced carbon dating. This is the dude that invented the technology that proved that like the stuff that we say was in Jesus's tomb could not have been and was totally a fake.
I will clarify. He played a part in that, but it was other people who kind of like took it to that level. Yes. But absolutely true that he was a crucial player in that story.
Okay. He invented a crazy piece of spyware, the pen camera, a pen that takes photos. Not a joke.
Yeah, it's like very James Bond.
Very James Bond. Okay. He was the first person to X-ray the pyramids looking for secret chambers. And then he also got involved in the Kennedy assassination. He was the leading scientist backing the lone gunman theory. But then he also invented an optometrist tool that helps ophthalmologists or optometrists, I can never know the difference between the two of them, like do eye exams that is still used to this day, right? And in optometrist offices. So what of all of his inventions was your favorite, like Louis gadget?
I'll pick one. So just, the kind of the bigger picture here is that he built stuff. Okay. This is why I was kind of drawn to him, because I'm not a physicist. I think theoretical physics is probably beyond my capacity to understand at this point because I didn't study it in college. But Alvarez was an experimenter. and he was very hands-on. He was very inventive. He liked, he knew how to like use, he knew how to blow glass. He was very comfortable in the machine shop. And his first instinct when it came to like a new problem was can I build something that will help us solve this problem, and this happens again and again. Yes. This is like kind of a constant. He does this when he's a kid. He does this when he's at Berkeley, in the 30s. He does this at the Manhattan Project, very famously. He does this.
I see him as more of an engineer, frankly, than a physicist. Although he definitely was a physicist.
Well, he could excel at every stage. That's the cool thing. He's like a guy who's like very good at sitting in a room by himself and thinking of ideas, but also he can oversee these big engineering projects. All right. So the one I want to talk about, just because I haven't talked about it yet, when I'm doing like events for this book, is the pyramids. Okay, and this to me is like a really cool story because it is really revealing. Because Alvarez just kind of likes wandering into these fields, and you're like, why is he even like, looking into these things, because he feels like he's got these skills. He's got the skill set as like an inventor and as like an experimenter that, he can think of things that haven't occurred to people who have been doing this stuff for years. All right. And so he reads about the pyramids. And he knows that the pyramid of Khufu or Cheops, which is the big one, has a bunch of chambers, all right? And the pyramid of Khephren, the second biggest one, has only one chamber that we know of. In fact, it's beneath the pyramid, and so there are no known chambers within the pyramid of Khephren itself. And he's like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, this is, Khufu or Cheops' son. And so if my father had built a pyramid with
tons of chambers,
with a bunch of chambers, I also would want to build a pyramid with a bunch of chambers. So there must be chambers here that no one has seen. And he's like, how can I use like my skills to like x-ray the pyramid, right? Because usually these chambers, you find them by chance. You're just kind of like digging around and you stumble across something. It's like, there has to be like a systematic way to like kind of scan the pyramid. Mm-hmm. And he comes up with this like really clever idea, which is that there are these things called cosmic rays, which are always bombarding the Earth with particles from space. And one of them is a muon, which is kind of like a big negative particle. And there are muons passing through all of us, at all times, right? And he says, you put a detector in the one known chamber at the base of this pyramid that detects how many muons are coming from different directions. Mm-hmm. And if there's one area where there are more than usual, it implies that there is a cavity.
An easier path.
Because normally, like the muons are absorbed by the stone, right? And so fewer will reach your detector. And so if there's like one spot where there are a bunch of muons, that's probably because there's an empty space there. Right? And so he actually figures out, this like cool gadget. He negotiates with the Egyptian government, and like gets permission.
Gets kicked out.
Yes. So, to him, it's also like a political problem. Like he really enjoys these problems where you have to like talk to people in power and kind of, convince them to support this idea. Yeah. And so he's able to install it in the late 60s. It runs for years. And the punchline is that pyramid is totally solid. There is nothing in there. There are no chambers. And
there are 0 chambers. Although later, don't they find one very little one at the top? Was that one, or was that another one?
This is actually in the pyramid of Cheops, which is like the Great Pyramid. And they so they actually use the same exact technique that Alvarez used more recently to find undiscovered chambers in the Great Pyramid. Alvarez just picked the wrong pyramid, right? He picked the pyramid that is just a big pile of blocks. And, to me, like, what I love is that, whenever people say, oh, you didn't find anything in the pyramid or you didn't find any chambers, he said no. Or, if, he failed to find any chambers, he said no. We proved there were no chambers. That's right. Right? Like, we know without a doubt now there are no chambers in that pyramid. So, on some level, he was able to spin that as a success, But he was disappointed. I mean, he knew that if you found like an undiscovered chamber in this pyramid, it would be the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. Yeah. It might contain who knows what, right? After
he thought he was going to have another Tutankhamun, discovery of riches of gold and jewels.
Yeah, but he aimed high, right? He always aimed for really attention-grabbing, high-profile experiments.
Well, those are both 2 examples from later in his career, but let's go back to the beginning of his career and or say earlier. And there were 2 things that caught my attention. One was a program called Vixen, which I just loved the name Vixen. And this was critical to the United States or the Allies' ability to outmaneuver the U-boats. And then he also invented the radar system that enabled planes to make blind landings. So which one do you want to talk about, Vixen or blind?
I'll talk about both briefly because to me the cool part here is that Alvarez is essentially recruited to join the MIT radar project And this is before Pearl Harbor. Like, we know that we're going to enter the war at some point, and we know that radar is going to be crucial. Airborne radar is going to be crucial, in all kinds of ways to win the war against Germany and Japan. But he is not a radar expert. He hasn't even heard of it. Like, he is told that, we have some kind of like invention that uses pulses, in some kind of military application, but he doesn't quite, he can't figure out what that is until he gets there and is told, well, this is what we're doing, right? Okay. But the reason they chose him is that he is a good guy to have on your team. Like, he just understands how to build stuff. He's really clever, even though he doesn't have the background. You're like, well, this guy could probably figure something out if we bring him in, if we recruit him to work on these problems. So, for example, the Vixen project is basically you want to use radar to detect German submarines. All right, so you have fighter planes that have radar, and you can send out these pulses, and the reflected pulses back to you tell you where the submarine is.
Beep,
right?
beep, beep.
The issue is that the submarines figure out how to detect those pulses, so they know when a plane is looking for them, and so they will, dive below the surface to elude those fighter planes. What Alvarez realizes is that as the plane is approaching the submarine, the beam can be turned down a little bit and still be useful as radar. And so as the plane gets closer, the radar, the intensity of the beam is reduced, so it looks like the plane is leaving.
Looks like
right?
the plane's going farther away.
And so it fools the subs into thinking that the plane is actually going away when it's actually going closer. And so it outfoxes the subs, so it's called Vixen.
I love that name.
Yeah.
Okay, and then blind landings, because just basically that these planes would get beat up, but were capable of landing, except they weren't capable of landing.
Well, it is that, normally when you want to land a plane, you have to be able to see the runway, right? And if you can't see the runway, what do you do, right? If it's cloudy, if it's nighttime, what do you do? And you realize that, we have radar that can track planes because when I shoot them down, we can use the same radar to guide planes to a runway.
Right.
And so basically it was just this very elaborate system where you have the control van, you have a radar system set up to track a plane, and you have a guy with headphones who says, okay, go to the left, go to the right, go up, go down. And you're giving verbal directions to the pilot to let him land safely, right? And this is a huge deal. No one had ever done this before, and he had to invent a new kind of radar system to do it. He had to figure out not just the technology, but how do you give verbal instructions to a pilot who's flying blind so they can land? And how do you get them to trust you? You're just this guy on the ground, and in many cases they hadn't even heard of this system. And you have this, mysterious voice saying, just follow my directions, it'll be fine. So, it's a human problem as well as a technical one.
What's amazing is that of all the things that we've talked about so far, and we have more, none of these things are the things that won him the Nobel. We're not even there yet. So let's do a couple more before we get to the thing that won him the Nobel Prize in physics. So he gets assigned the Manhattan Project, and boy, the politics of that organization. But what he works on, what he focuses on, is the implosion mechanism, the detonation of the implosion mechanism. And then he actually goes up in the second plane, right? The second plane, not the first, not Enola Gay, the second plane, and watches the bomb. Is this little man, I think, or fat man?
He observes the little boy bomb that destroys Hiroshima.
Right.
Right. And then his implosion mechanism is used in the plutonium bomb that destroys Nagasaki.
Okay. So let's talk about the implosion mechanism and how important that problem was and how gnarly that problem was.
Yeah. So there are two kinds of atomic bombs that were used during World War II. All right. There's a uranium bomb, little boy, and there's a plutonium bomb, fat man. All right. Little boy, for various reasons, you can just shoot a piece of uranium at another piece of uranium, and it'll probably blow up. Right. It is not that hard to construct what's called the gun mechanism.
Okay.
And so that was, the hardest part in that case was getting all the enriched uranium you needed to actually create a chain reaction. So that, but the actual mechanism was straightforward. For plutonium, you can't do the gun method because plutonium will pre-detonate. It has to go really fast because if it isn't fast enough, it just kind of fizzle out and it'll blow up the bomb. It'll have a local explosion, but not the atomic explosion that you want.
Okay.
And so you have to have what's called the implosion method, where you have a sphere of plutonium that is squeezed down into a smaller sphere that, can achieve a critical mass. And that is really hard because it has to be uniform. Like if it's not uniform, if like that sphere is not squeezed down in just the right way, same thing. It's not going to detonate in the way you want it to. And so Alvarez played a key role in trying to figure out how do you like wire this thing so that all 32 detonators would go off at the same time. And we're talking about like within like milliseconds. I mean, it has to be incredibly precise. And again, he's not an explosive expert. He just kind of like shows up, in Los Alamos and is assigned to this problem and figures out the solution, which again, like there would be no atomic bomb, for better or for worse, no plutonium bomb if it weren't for Alvarez. Like in terms of like the detonation system that he, again, just kind of like figured out, based on an idea he had that he was able to convince them to try out.
So I believe that you could have portrayed him as a villain. You could have written an entire biography of him as the villain, because there is, I think, in the light of history, a very dark period in his life. We're going to talk about that right now, but I wanted to note that Alvarez wrote his own autobiography before you wrote his biography. And what we're about to talk about, he left out of his own autobiography. And that is very, very telling. So how many people here have seen, or if you're online, feel free to thumbs up in the chat, have seen the movie Oppenheimer? Okay. So those of you who've seen it know that Oppenheimer, who led the Manhattan Project, has his security clearance revoked. And in the movie, the lead villain is a guy named Leo Strauss. He's played by Robert Downey Jr. in that movie. What, probably because it was already a 4-hour film or something, there was not enough space to put in that there was a assistant villain, let's just say, or an associate villain. And that clearly was Luis Alvarez. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this. I want to say something, and I want you to respond about whether my kind of summation of this is correct, or if we really need to, you can correct me. But after the war, a scientist named Teller, Edward Teller, leads an effort to build, and this is very controversial, an even more powerful bomb, a bomb known as a hydrogen bomb, which has never been used in warfare, at least. And Alvarez is clearly pro-H-bomb, and Oppenheimer is not. Oppenheimer has grown to have doubts. Mm-hmm. And I felt that Alvarez's anger, and willingness to testify in support of the revoking of Oppenheimer's security clearance totally came down to the fact that he felt that Oppenheimer was absolutely standing in the way of the development of a hydrogen bomb, and that he felt that that was absolutely needed for our national defense. So walk us through kind of this dark history that he left out of his own autobiography.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have it, pretty much, dead on. So the key thing to mention here is that Oppenheimer and Alvarez were friends. Like you actually do see Alvarez briefly in the movie Oppenheimer. There's a really cute scene where Oppenheimer sees Alvarez running out of a barber shop. And he's just read a newspaper article saying the Germans have split the atom. Oh. And there's like a scene afterward where like Alvarez demonstrates to him that this is possible and it could lead to a bomb. And then he disappears from the movie. Okay. Right. That's that. This
was already a 4-hour movie, and there are a lot of people involved.
I got really excited when I saw Alvarez. I'm like the one person that like basically applauded when he showed up in that movie. But yeah. So what happens later is that Oppenheimer recruits Alvarez to work on the Manhattan Project, and they stay like pretty close professionally until the early 50s. And as you say, they differ over the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb. And you're right. It is a question of what do you think is the right approach when the Soviet Union gets, their own atomic bomb?
Right.
Do you try to like de-escalate?
Outbomb them?
Or do you scale up?
Right.
And Alvarez was definitely like in the let's scale up, let's build a super bomb, super, literally, that will kind of preserve our advantage in the arms race. And Oppenheimer said, he had reservations, which I think were justifiable. And Alvarez felt that Oppenheimer's opposition to the thermonuclear bomb was impeding the project. and he felt as a matter of national security, we needed to prioritize like the H-bomb. And I think you're correct. I think that the Oppenheimer hearing, and this is kind of like the consensus view, right?
First, he declines to testify, and then he goes and testifies.
Yeah.
And just throws the nail in the coffin on the dude.
Yes. Alvarez knows that if he testifies against Oppenheimer, this is going to be not popular because the vast majority of scientists are on Oppenheimer's side, and only a few people like Teller and Alvarez testify against him at the hearing. And they do it because they want to neutralize him. They want to kind of sideline him so they can just pursue the super, program.
Without feeling guilty about it.
Yeah.
Without having a public.
Yeah. And Oppenheimer has communist friends. You can make an interesting case that he is a security risk. And so, whether or not you believe that, it is a very good reason to kind of get him out of the picture.
Yep.
And so Ernest Lawrence, Josh Hartnett, for those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, this is Alvarez's mentor. And Lawrence is also, on Alvarez's side, he wants to see the H-bomb,
But he declines
developed.
to testify.
But Lawrence knows that if he testifies, he is going to be seen as, maybe not a traitor, but, as part of this, conspiracy that's, devoted to bringing down Oppenheimer, and it could cause him problems. So Lawrence withdraws, and he advises Alvarez to withdraw. But then Louis Strauss, the Robert Downey Jr. character in Oppenheimer, calls Alvarez and essentially
Berates him,
maybe threatens him. That conversation is very interesting and mysterious, but for whatever reason, Alvarez decides to go and testify. All right. And it is very controversial. It haunts him, in some ways for the rest of his life. And yes, so when the time came to write his autobiography, which is like a massive typescript, that covers everything he ever did in great detail, he skips over that chapter entirely. He does not talk about what happened there at all.
And I love the quote you put in the book, something like, "I didn't want to go there."
Yeah, so I don't know. Richard Rhodes is a really good, by really good, I mean incredible historian, of the atomic bomb.
Prize winner, I believe.
And he worked on Alvarez's memoir with him. And, so Rhodes asked Alvarez, why don't you talk about this incredibly important, episode? And Alvarez says, I don't want to go there. And so Rhodes has to essentially reconstruct that section from the Oppenheimer hearing transcript.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so that's the one chapter in Alvarez's autobiography that Rhodes ghost wrote, essentially, because Alvarez didn't want to talk about it, but Rhodes and I think that clearly it's an important story to tell.
So I just have two more questions, and we'll go to online, I believe. Jennifer will come out and we'll take some questions here from the audience as well. So he wins the Nobel for nothing, again, that we've discussed thus far, not Vixen, not blind landings, not pyramid scans, not the dinosaurs, but he wins for something called a bubble chamber. And not the build of the bubble chamber, that goes to Glaser from the University of Michigan, even though they collaborated because they were up for together. But I think Oppenheimer, you didn't say in the book who opposed his thing, but I felt like it was Oppenheimer. Someone wrote it.
I mean, it was more likely Ed McMillan, who was, again, kind of his rival at the lab.
Yeah. Okay. But instead, he gets the Nobel for basically what he discovers from using a bubble chamber. You want to talk about a bubble chamber and why his discovery won him the Nobel?
Yeah, no, I've heard people say that Alvarez won the Nobel Prize for the least interesting thing that he ever did. But, that's not, that might be true actually, but it is super interesting because everything else he did was very interesting. So it's a high bar. So basically, this is a time when physics is going to higher and higher energies. To find new stuff, you have to build bigger and bigger cyclotrons and particle accelerators. And so those accelerators are getting really powerful, but you also need ways to detect what's happening, to kind of record these interactions that you're making, at a big scale. And the detectors of that time are not really suited to that, to the sort of scaling up again of the accelerator side. Alvarez says we need ways to detect millions of events every year because we're generating millions of events, and unless we have a good way to detect them and analyze them, all this data is going to go to waste, right? And so Don Glaser invents this device called the bubble chamber, which basically it's like, Glaser's version is like an inch long, right? It's like this tiny glass chamber filled with ether, like a liquid, that will boil along a path whenever a particle enters it. So you can see this trail of bubbles, right? It's like literally a track of bubbles that you can photograph and then look at that photograph and say, okay, so what is this? What's happening here? And you can see like, these collisions, and you see these spirals, and, you have to you have to develop ways of understanding what this stuff represents. Alvarez says, well, number one, we have to make it way bigger because
2 inches, I think they go to.
imagine going from this to 6 feet long, right? And it's full of liquid hydrogen, which is like incredibly explosive. It's like really dangerous. And so you have to like figure out a way to like cryogenically lower the temperature of hydrogen, keep it from exploding, and also develop like this system for photographing and analyzing all this data. So we're talking like millions of photographs eventually, and it's more than any human being can possibly analyze. And so Alvarez also says, well, we have to use computers. We have to use, data analysis methods to like, kind of automate this process that used to be manual. And so it's like this massive operation, right? But he's like, to understand what this data we're generating, we need to like develop the, kind of the associated analytics. And so basically, once this is in place, you just start seeing particles. You start seeing data.
18 new particles were discovered thanks to the bubble chamber or something.
And things that no one was even looking for, right? Like, because like, there are two kinds of things you can do with like this kind of technology. You can look for particles the theorists predict exist. You can look for them and see, to verify the theory. Or you can just like look at the photos and see what's there, because you will see things that no one expected, right? And so most of the stuff that he ends up discovering or that it facilitates, these are particles that no one knew to even look for, but would pop up in the data.
To maybe give an analogy to a modern day, like, we've heard maybe of CERN in Switzerland, like the world's largest particle accelerator. That device costs like billions and billions of dollars, and it was needed in order to find the last particle that the theoretical physicist surmised existed, but we, the experimental physicists, had not yet actually found in nature. So this is kind of that, almost like the parent, right, or a different type of technology, but a parent to that project.
Well, the one thing I want to like also underline is that eventually Alvarez got really bored by this, because it's kind of like it's a little bit.
And repeat.
It's not mindless, but it's kind of rote, right? You have all this material and you go through it and you ask the computer to like pick out interesting histograms, whatever, and it's not like it kind of lacks the mystery and like the romance that brought him to physics. And so he literally says that if he were a young scientist going into physics, then he wouldn't join his own group, because it was too dull.
Too dull.
Yeah, and so this is the time he starts doing the pyramids. He looks into like the Kennedy assassination. He starts to like kind of freelance in this interesting way, because he's no longer interested in like the big science that his own like project has created.
Okay, my last question before we turn to the audience. Of all the people you could write about, even just all the people whose names are mentioned in this book, there's like 10 Nobel winners that are mentioned in this book, at least. Of all those people who worked on the Manhattan Project, like, why did you pick him?
Mostly because he was available. As you say, there are, many Oppenheimer biographies, Feynman, Fermi, like the big names, they've all been claimed. And again, I can't underline this enough. I'm still astonished that no one had written the Alvarez biography, because it is so interesting. Like, I know I'm biased here, but when I realized, probably just going on Wikipedia, reading about him and seeing there was no biography of him, I'm like, I got to write this, because I can understand it, or I can learn it in a way that I could not learn, to write the biography of a theorist. But it just gives me an excuse to learn all this cool stuff. All right. So we talked about a lot of things. We didn't even talk about the Kennedy assassination stuff, which I literally spent like an hour talking about a few weeks ago.
I couldn't do it. I read it. I mean, I'm just like, oh my God. Like,
because that's how I first heard about him, the Kennedy stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So that's really interesting. The Manhattan Project is fascinating, and the dinosaurs,
Right.
So it's like the idea that there's like one guy whose career encompasses all these things, who hadn't been the subject of a book yet. Like, to me, it was just mind-blowing. So yeah, I was like, I got to do this before somebody else does.
Okay. Jennifer, how does this work with the online audience questions? Do you have one?
Yes. So I will start us off with a question from the audience here. Let me just pull it up. Sorry. Okay. What was the most surprising thing you learned in your research, and did it change your mind at all about anything you previously thought about science?
Yeah. So the biggest surprise occurred when I was preparing to propose the book to my to an editor, right? So I don't know if you know how like nonfiction proposals work, but before you write the book, you have to kind of pre-write the book and like write a 30-page document that kind of explains like why this person is worth studying. Okay, why is this a good idea for a book? And so after I kind of realized that Alvarez was available and interesting, I was like, okay, I have to do like a little bit of research just to kind of write that proposal. And the obvious place to start was his autobiography. And so I read the autobiography, underlined, every page, and it's full of cool stuff. It's really interesting. And I'm like, okay, this is great. This guy is an obvious, like a role model. Like he's an incredibly inspiring figure. And so I wrote an entire draft of this proposal. And I was about to like send it out when I came across, I can't even remember what it was, but it was a reference to Alvarez as being this guy who just like loved to cause pain, who loved power and, being able to like control other people,
man.
And I would find things.
He would be maybe like one of those people who would get canceled like in modern day.
Yeah. I found all this stuff that like said like, he was known as like this, son of a bitch at Berkeley. And, like one of his like students like later said to me that he was maybe the most hated person at the Berkeley lab. This is not anywhere in his autobiography. All right. You read that autobiography and you get the impression that Alvarez was this like great guy who everyone loved to work with and there was no issue with him whatsoever. But no, he was an incredibly difficult person. All right. And I think even his family, his students will acknowledge this. Okay. So that was the surprise, right? The idea that, the kind of the picture of Alvarez that comes out of his own, narrative of his life, very different from the version of him that comes out of talking to other people and reading accounts from other scientists.
Yeah, there was one story in there where he's basically screaming at this graduate student, and the guy comes in and observes this. He walks out for several minutes or whatever, and then comes back and he's still yelling at the graduate student. And the first thing I thought was like, this guy, if he existed right now, would get canceled, right, Waylon? Yeah. Do we want to do a question here?
If someone has a question, if you wouldn't mind coming up so we can all hear it.
Yeah, there's folks online who need to hear you, so thank you.
And feel free to come on up, anybody, after this gentleman.
Hi. I was just wondering, like, during the process of writing biographies in general, how do you become like critical of like what to include, what to not include? Like, how do you look at an autobiography and like go from there?
This is a great question, right? Because clearly Alvarez's memoir is an important source, and I was able to read the uncut draft of his autobiography, which is like probably twice as long as the published version, and it goes into a lot of detail about this stuff. But no, it is his version of events, right? And you have to account for that because he talks about some of his colleagues. I mentioned Ed McMillan, who was his rival at the Berkeley lab, and this is a funny story. So in the memoir, in his papers at Berkeley, there is a chapter called Hardball Physics. And it says, this is to be published only after my death. And this is where he told all of his, pent up, kind of rage at what he saw as the, unfair treatment he'd received from McMillan and other people. That, again, it's an incredible source. But you read other sources and, other physicists at the lab at that point say McMillan was like doing his best, but Alvarez just antagonized him constantly.
Yeah, I love that part. I remember.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and this is true. I've read a couple of previous books about people who are not always the most reliable narrators of their own lives. And I think, you just have to kind of like triangulate a little bit. With Alvarez, what I found is that he is really good on factual material. Like his memory for like dates and like, locations was excellent. I didn't find many errors in his memoir, but a lot of omissions, right? And a lot of, examples of him giving his side of the story. And so I had to be very careful when it came to like, balancing that with other perspectives.
But did you kind of organize the book around the inventions, like wanting to kind of like talk about all the invention highlights and the stories behind them?
Yeah, I mean, this is a story about science, and there's a lot of science in the book, and so I clearly wanted to hit all the high points in his life. I didn't want to like omit anything that I thought was interesting. But obviously, you have to be like a little bit selective. Like there were like entire things he worked on where I could have written a chapter that ended up being a paragraph. But I mean.
Television being one of them.
He worked on like this TV project with Lawrence. He worked on a lot of these things for like air traffic control. I mean, I could go on, right? But I think as a guiding principle, I was like, I want this to be kind of a handbook on how to do science, because that was what Alvarez saw his life as. And so in terms of like selecting, and emphasizing certain things, like does this story shed light on what he did and how he did things, how he thought? So it was hard to cut the things down, but whenever I had issues with like length, I would think to myself, does this shed light on that central theme?
Thank you.
Other questions in the room? Oh, great.
Come on up.
And
if you
then
got-
you can go next, and then we'll go up.
So, did you have a chance to inspect any of his original research, photos, the rock, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I did see The Rock. I saw The Rock last week. That was very cool. I got to hold it and look at it through a little hand lens. His papers obviously are at Berkeley, or at least copies are at Berkeley. So I got to go through everything. And I mean, the nice thing about writing about a scientist is that there is an abundant archive of material. He worked on the Manhattan Project, and so very few things in history have been written about more than the Manhattan Project. And so it was almost a question of too much, information. But no, I mean, and I got to go to Berkeley Lab, see where he worked. Some of those artifacts are still there. Again, like this is a guy who is very hands-on, and so unlike a theorist where you're like working your way through equations, you can go and still see like the original 10-inch Revell chamber. You can still see all these like artifacts, right?
And all four of his children are still alive, right? But Walt is obviously the famous one. That's the one who helped figure out the dinosaur mystery. And he is still a world-renowned geologist. What happened to his other three kids?
So the three children are still alive. So there are two from his first marriage and two from his second marriage, which was to a much younger woman, and so there's a big age gap between the siblings. But yeah, no, they were all incredibly helpful. Walter especially was, he would admit this. I'm sure he's very guarded. In part because like the controversy over the dinosaur thing was so toxic. Like it really scarred him, I think, in ways that he still hasn't quite gotten over yet. And so it took a while for him to open up. Yeah, but no, I mean, incredibly useful information about Alvarez, who, does not reveal much about his inner life in his writings. If you want to know about the science, it's fantastic. You can, there's more than enough material about all these projects, but, things like his divorce and his, relationships with his children or his father, you have to kind of like read between the lines a little bit. And so talking to the family was very helpful.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so in fiction, you have this opportunity as a writer to tell or say a message associated with the story, right? Like what are you trying to say as a writer, not just the narrator in the book. With a biography like this, is there a central message that you would like to share about Alvarez or just life?
Yeah, no question. I mean, biography to me is like a literary genre, right? And a biographer has to shape material and, as I said, like be selective. And I said on the one hand, I kind of saw this as being like a handbook for how to do science. But there is like a kind of a flip side. And to me, it's about the limits of intelligence, the limits of science, because I think Alvarez's life really reflects that as well. Alvarez is the smartest guy who I could plausibly write a book about. I mean, he's so ingenious and clever in all kinds of ways. Like I said, from just sitting in a room thinking about stuff to building these huge projects. If you had a problem, like he's the guy you want to call. But there are things he couldn't solve, right? There are things where his skills were not suited to that problem. So things like, the Kennedy assassination, he was very clever about finding ways to test his theories about whether was there just one shooter, where did the bullets come from. But, you really can't resolve these things with science. There's always a counter argument. And so I kind of like make it clear that Alvarez wanted there to be some definitive answer to, the Kennedy assassination that would resolve, this mystery. But, it wasn't going to happen. And politically, like you think about what happened with Oppenheimer, you think about what happened with the arms race, there are things that Alvarez's skill set was not equipped to address, right? And to me, that is a big part of that story. And so toward the end, I talk about this, that there are these, wicked problems that even someone like Alvarez like really can't get a handle on. And so it was important to me to make that point.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Your book is absolutely fantastic. It's just absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Two very quick questions. Number one, there's so much science in it, which is one of the things I loved. And I'm wondering, do you have a science background, because you describe it so well? That's my first question.
The answer is no. I was not a science major. I majored in classics in college, so ancient Greek and Latin, which I've also forgotten. And that was part of the appeal. It's like I wanted to learn the stuff, and I think being able to like learn it and explain it in a way that is clear to kind of the average reader, which I am one. That was a big part of the appeal of this project, because I'm like, no matter what the reception is, no matter how people read this book, I will learn this stuff. And I will kind of internalize it in ways that I thought was really exciting. But also, as I've said a few times, Alvarez was the kind of person I could see myself understanding. There isn't a single equation in the whole book, right? It's all descriptions, verbal descriptions of what he did and what he built in ways that I hope are, accessible to lay readers. But that was a big part of why I chose him in the first place.
You did a great job describing his science. Really good job. And are you able to tell us what your next book will be about?
Yeah, so this kind of ties in a little bit to some of the themes I just mentioned, the limits of intelligence. So the next book is about the RAND Corporation, which is the original think tank. It's a Cold War think tank that, produced a lot of thought about nuclear strategy, especially in the 60s. And a bunch of RAND civilian analysts were hired to come to the Pentagon by Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, to kind of overhaul the Defense Department. And these are all smart guys, incredibly intelligent guys. And the result was, a huge arms race and the Vietnam War. And so, when it comes to like the limits of intelligence and kind of where these ideas come from and what they have done, I think the RAND Corporation is a pretty cool subject. So it's going to be called Whiz Kids, and it's coming out hopefully in 2028.
If you had had the opportunity to meet Alvarez and you could ask him one question, what would that question be?
Well, that's a good question, because I have questions. I don't know how well he would react. I don't know how amenable he would be. So on the assumption I could kind of like ease into it, I want to know more about his first wife, that marriage, because Geraldine Alvarez was clearly a brilliant woman, had a huge influence on her kids. He barely talks about what happened. And so to kind of reconstruct what happened in that marriage, I've had to like really just like squeeze every piece of, information I can find, as opposed to like, his various projects where there's more than enough, information. The marriage to me is still kind of a mystery. And so, to me, I always try to do justice to the wives, especially the first wives, who tend to get a bad, less than a fair shake in the authorized version of, these men's stories. I think I do an okay job, but there's a lot of stuff about that marriage that is still kind of mysterious to me. So, again, I kind of doubt Alvarez would answer those questions, but that's kind of what I would love to know more about.
So I'm going to finish this out with, or Jennifer, I have, do you want to do one on mine and then I'll finish out with
Yes,
one?
perfect. We have one final question from a virtual viewer, which is, many people think Telly's testimony against Oppenheimer was more of a betrayal than Alvarez's statements. What was the relationship between the two of them?
Between Alvarez and Oppenheimer? Or Alvarez and Teller? It's unclear? Okay. This is a good question. So Alvarez managed to avoid being as associated with the testimony that he gave as teller. And you could kind of wonder why that is. Teller obviously is more famous, right? Teller is kind of a higher profile figure.
He invented the H-bomb.
Right. A lot of people know who Edward Teller is in a way that Alvarez, while really famous within the science community, was less of a public figure. And that's part of it. And you talk about like betrayal, I think that Alvarez clearly, decided that his advocacy for the H-bomb was more important than his friendship with Oppenheimer. Okay. I don't know as much about Teller and Oppenheimer, but I know that Alvarez and Oppenheimer, they went back for years. They worked together at Berkeley. Oppenheimer had recruited Alvarez to the Manhattan Project. So there was a lot of respect there. And I think, it is very hard to read some of the things that Alvarez says, because he does say, Oppenheimer is like my scientific hero. I have nothing but respect for what he did in the Manhattan Project. And I think that's true. I don't think he was being disingenuous. I think he actually did respect Oppenheimer on that level. But he knew what he was doing. He deliberately went in knowing that the goal was to remove Oppenheimer from a position of influence within the security, within the debate over
Security community.
Especially the debate over nuclear policy, and he succeeded. And that was a choice he made. So I think that every reader will have to draw their own conclusions about the ethical implications of what he did.
So I'm going to close this out with one final question, just because we're here at the Chicago Public Library, and there is a lot of Chicago in this book. Maybe if you could just tell the audience some things that maybe they might be able to see around town, or maybe just about the history of Argonne and Fermilab and what's out there, and how they, tie into kind of his story.
Yeah, so Chicago enters the story at a couple of points.
Several times.
Yeah, so Alvarez, interestingly enough, was born in the Bay Area. Originally thought about going to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, but was advised to go to Chicago because that's where all three of the American Nobel laureates in physics were teaching. So Chicago was kind of the place to go if you wanted to go into physics. But then later he goes back to Berkeley because he essentially says that the glory days of the Chicago physics department were over at that point. That they were talking about the old days. He says it's like a Tennessee Williams play where they're just sitting around reminiscing about how great it used to be. But he goes there and they don't comment on each other's experiments. It's bad manners to criticize someone. They kind of working in isolation. And then he goes to Berkeley and they're working in this kind of open space with all these workbenches. Everyone's up in each other's business and they're always asking questions and criticizing, and it's just much more exciting to him. So I think it's actually very revealing that he leaves Chicago, having done undergraduate and his PhD there, and goes back to Berkeley, which is kind of where he thought he would, go in the first place. Then later, during the war, he goes to Argonne Lab to work with Fermi, and we're running short on time, but that's actually one of my favorite sections of the book because Fermi was his hero, in terms of theorists and experimentalists, because Fermi was a theorist who became an experimentalist, which is really unusual. This is a guy who was one of the greatest theorists of his time, who then kind of trains himself to run these massive projects to build the first atomic pile. And there are all these stories about how smart Fermi was, which I think I'll just pass over here. But Alvarez was not easily awed by other people. He had a very high opinion of his own intelligence, for good reason. But Fermi is the one person who made Alvarez feel, like he was not the smartest guy in the room.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and the Chicago Public Library for having us, and thank you guys for being here.
And thank you to Alec and Melissa. One more round of applause. Thank you so much. I do have to say, we have hosted Alec every book he writes. We host him here for a program. So if you haven't checked out his prior books, please check them out. Also, they are, of course, available at the library, and there's a hefty hold